Good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on your location. We want to welcome you again to our discussions in First Corinthians. Last week in well, not last week, the week before last, our discussion, we were looking at First Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 5. And in those verses, of course, we were discussing the examples that Paul was using to remind the brethren of the situation that occurred with regard to the children of Israel, uh, and how, as a result of their spiritual failures, they, of course, were left behind. When we look at those verses, we notice that there's this problem of overconfidence. We notice that with the Corinthians, they were, of course, uh, seemingly having difficulty seeing how they had departed on the path away from righteousness. And Paul uses the example of the children of Israel, where he speaks of how all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all baptized under Moses in the sea, uh, all did eat the same spiritual meat, drink the same spiritual drink. And he makes that the correlation there with just as Israel failed, so the church can fail if we find ourselves uh, in dereliction of duty. And I think here what we want to continue in our study with the verses that follow, verses 6 through 10. I'll read those verses and then we'll come in and discuss them. We have David and Eileen, we have Brian and Sonny, and we have Michael Hatcher with us today. And we're glad that you're able to join us. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 6 through 10. Now these things were our examples to the intent we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. Neither be ye idolaters as some of them, as it is written. The people sat down to eat and drink and rose to play. Neither let us commit fornication as some of them committed, and fell in one day 3,000. Neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed of serpents. Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured, and were destroyed of the destroyer. And I think when we look at these verses, something pops out very clearly again, harkening back to the previous examples that he had given in the first 5 verses. He's here again talking about the warning to the church, warning to the New Testament Christian. We see there that the scripture says clearly, explicitly, what happened to Israel is a warning, an example to us. When we read verses like this, certainly again we think about Romans 15:4, the things that are written aforetime, written for our learning, and we look at the scriptures and understand that they provide us with guidance, and oftentimes that guidance is in the form of warnings. And we want when we look at that here, what happened to them, what happened to Israel can happen to us. And of course, if it does, then the doom that fell upon Israel will fall upon us. So each one of these verses, Paul provides them with examples, specific examples that as we preach and teach and as we think about how we want to live our own Christian lives, we can look back to the scriptures and certainly get some guidance there. Sonny, when we talk about examples, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, using metaphors, um, do we give enough emphasis to this type of teaching that Paul exhibits here? He's definitely talking to them very clearly about the issues that are present, but using the power of the example from what they knew in the past. Now, of course, our members, we know the past in a far more distant way, but we still have to bring that power of example to them. Do we find that being? Uh, Let me ask you: do you find that being a very powerful way of teaching, using that example and making, of course, the correlation? That's what we're supposed to do. But sometimes you can preach and not use examples. You can just quote the verses. But when we present a thorough, meticulous, uh, verse by verse um, correlation, do you find that that's more helpful to people when you're teaching them?
Well, when you talk about examples, first of all, that there are examples which can be hypothetical. Okay, I try to avoid using hypothetical examples when it comes to in my preaching and teaching, because those hypothetical examples are only examples, as I would call them. But I prefer to use biblical examples, as I said to one of the brothers who's learning to preach, is avoid using worldly examples, but rather use biblical examples, for a very simple reason, because that when we use biblical examples, what we are seeing is a picture of God's reaction to certain behavioral patterns. So in that way, as Paul said, that these things become our examples. In other words, these are not just hypothetical examples, but living examples. Today that we live in a world that people talk about, I think that God will accept me as I am, or I believe that God will, be happy with this. But nothing beats biblical examples, because from the biblical examples, you can say with certainty that it's not whether maybe that God or perhaps that God will accept it. It's that God has shown that He has not accepted that, and He will not accept that sort of behavior. So you can know for certain that this is the divine will, in terms of certain behavioral patterns, attitudes that you talk about, or lifestyle standards, because God has already expressed through the examples His approval or His disapproval of it. So I think that in that way, that the lesson becomes more practical and realistic rather than relying on hypothetical examples.
And as you said, it gives the when we look at the book of First Corinthians, especially here in chapter 10, it doesn't really give the Corinthians any wiggle room. It outlines very specifically, very meticulously, what had happened with the children of Israel. He correlates this also through the actions of the Corinthian church. And I think when you use it that way, and he doesn't need to use a hypothetical. The people that you reference or the example that you were giving, oftentimes people want to say, "Well, as you said, I think God will be accepting of me," but it has no biblical basis. It's just an emotion. It's just a response. It's really a selfish attempt at self-justification for one's actions. When you parallel that or compare that to the example of God's, as you say, God's reaction to certain sin, then they don't have any place to fall back. They don't have anything to say, well, that's your opinion. And I think that that's a good way that we can see how Paul addresses things here. When we look at the text, the very first thing that he mentions here, or at least what he begins with, these things were our examples, and he begins to the intent we should not lust after evil things. Now, I think that when he says that, it's very obvious that he is pointing out to the Corinthians that that's a problem that they've had. I think when he says that, that's a problem. They lusted after evil things. Now, when we look at the text, we go back to the text. We can go back to Numbers 11 and 4, where it says, and following verses that following actually, they lusted and craved for the delicious foods of Egypt. And just that verse right there tells you the state of some people's minds, even sometimes, unfortunately, in the minds of some people in the church, still desiring the things that are worldly, still desiring the things that we're supposed to have left behind, still craving the things that when we were under bondage. And I think here Paul is very effective because as a result of that lust, you recall a plague breaks out, and in verse 34 it says that they died, and the place became known as the grave of greediness or of lust. And I think if we preach in the same way that Paul writes, it becomes very effective in showing people, as you said, Sonny, how God Himself deals with those things. He says, and this is a strong warning: we must not lust after evil things. And there are a host of Bible verses, Mark 4:19, the cares of the world, deceitfulness of riches, the lust of other things entering in, choking the word. These are things that when we preach and teach to people, and when we talk to people in our attempt to convert them, helping them see the very specific difference between what a life in the world is like and what the life in Christ must be. Paul writing to Timothy, 2 Timothy 2, flee youthful lusts, follow righteousness. All of those things put together help people to see what it is that God is expecting of us. Of course, we always use 1 John 2, 15 and 16, where he talks there about the things of the world, and he talks about them using that term lust. All that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. A person has to give themselves over to Jesus Christ. And if there's not one thing, I was going to say, if there's one thing that we can focus on, but obviously we see that Paul is focusing on more than one thing, just as John focuses on more than one thing in his writing in 1 John. We also see that Paul then goes from there, and he moves from lust. We could talk about. We can come back to that, but I just want to cover the points that we see in the verses 6 through 10. He moves from lust to idolatry, and that's not really a hard transition, is it, Michael? Aren't lust and idolatry really pretty closely tied in together?
They would be. Desires, which is lust, and when you place that desire above God, then you've gone into idolatry. So they would be very close.
And here he
and a natural transition from one to the other.
And as he says here, neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to be merry. Now, when we look at that, of course, we are already given the clue as to what that's with regard to. When Moses was on Mount Sinai, the people became, they were restless. They were waiting for Moses. They decided to go ahead, create their own form of worship. That's in Exodus 32. 32 and 5, Aaron's built the altar. Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. Here the people see the image of the golden calf. All of these things are dangers that the Corinthians are moving toward in a different way. But, if they participate in the different social functions of unbelievers, they'll fall into sin. 1 John 5:21, little children, keep yourself from idols. When we attach too much importance to things of the world, when we find ourselves feeling the need to be a part of parties and social gatherings and all of these sorts of things where we're in the homes of unbelievers and maybe they want to drink alcohol, or maybe they want to have on some sort of a television program that's unsuitable. All of these kinds of things can be a problem for God's people. And if we find ourselves looking to something else more than looking to God, there will again be mired in the morass that Paul is talking about here. Um, here we think about the children of Israel. The image of the golden calf was supposed to help them uh, uh, in some way picture and imagine God, I suppose. They needed some sort of other image. We think about the eating and drinking and the immorality that goes on. This is the kind of thing that Christians have to see. This is a danger. It comes back from the Old Testament. And he goes straight to that when he moves again, not in an unsubtle way at all. When he goes from lust to idolatry to fornication. Now, I think that Paul is, and of course he covers this with the Corinthians in chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8 in varying degrees. But of course, this was a situation that Israel was accused of. 20,000 of them committed fornication with their neighbors. This is in Numbers 25, 1 through 9, and many other situations. And of course, the Corinthians, Michael, they seem to think that they could get away with this. Why did they seem to think that they could get away with this?
No, I've never really considered it from the standpoint they thought they could get away with it. I've always thought more along the lines they just were disinterested in it.
Oh, you talking about from the standpoint of 1 Corinthians 5?
Yeah, even that, and you go on to this. I mean, they were just, they didn't care. They weren't interested enough to make changes within their life. They weren't interested enough to try to correct anyone else. They just thought they could continue on in their same old ways.
But also in 1 Corinthians 7 and the chapters that follow, it seems to be something that they felt that was all right societally. In society, it was okay for people going to the temple. It was okay for the people having prostitutes in the area. It didn't seem, as you say, they were disinterested. It didn't bother them.
Maybe, yeah, it didn't bother them. That's a good way to put it, I would say. And I was thinking maybe it was kind of like what happens today with Christians, that we become so accustomed to those things that it doesn't really make a difference with us. And you can see in our society how sin has made its inroads to where, Christians will, I hate to use the word accept things now that they would never accept before, that it doesn't bother them any at all because we've just grown accustomed to it. And maybe that's the same situation as to the Corinthians. They had just grown accustomed to those things because of society, and so it didn't really bother them anymore.
Would this also, now I don't want to go back to this particular issue and labor it, but that's where part of the issue of fellowship certainly plays a very large part. People are not concerned with sin to the extent that it will prevent them from continuing to have some sort of relationship with those people who are in sin. And that sin, in this particular case that I'm thinking about, is false doctrine. Now, false doctrine either is sin or it's not. And if it is sin, and we find ourselves engaging in any kind of activities with people who accept that, condone that, practice that, or even fellowship that, then that's pretty much the same thing, isn't it?
I would think so. And maybe that goes back again to they have become accustomed to these things and it just doesn't have any effect upon them. And it gets to the point false doctrine doesn't have any effect on them either. If and it goes both ways. If you compromise in one area, then why not the other area? If you can compromise in morals, then why can't you in false or in doctrine? If you compromise in doctrine, then why not in morals?
Oh, now you're starting to get too logical here. You know, but that's a point. That point that you make is really, I don't think people understand what a powerful point that is. If you can, as you said, if you can compromise on doctrine, you can compromise on morality.
I read an article years ago, and it didn't. At first, it didn't affect me, and I thought about it, and I understood after a while that denominationalism has led to immorality, and that is true because once you get that ecumenical movement and feeling that all of these, if I can compromise in this area of doctrine over here, and I can remain in fellowship with someone else who believes differently than I do on it, and what the scriptures teach, then why can't I compromise in this area of morality? And I think today we're seeing the results of that when you see these churches, and I use that accommodatively.
I simply call them religious organizations.
Yeah, or denominations that they will accept homosexuals now. Years ago, it wouldn't have even been thought of, but the groundwork was laid by the ecumenical ideas that it doesn't really matter if you believe differently. And so if I can believe differently, then why can't I believe differently about homosexuality and practice differently?
Well, I think that again, that when you look at any position and you look at that position, you have to look at what has to be accommodated by that position. And certainly, again, as you mentioned, if not, why not? And where and when does someone decide to draw the limits? And how can you draw limits when you've diminished or dissolved the limits? And certainly, if you're not willing to live in the doctrine of Christ, then you really are saying that there are no limits. You can justify, I mean, we've talked about this many times before. If you can justify one sin, you can justify any. And if you can justify any sin, then there's nothing that can be taken off the table, what we call murder or anything else. I mean, really, if you really want to get down to the logical aspects of it. Well, Paul here, making this, again, I think this is a list. I think this is a list of the kinds of things that Paul wants to address in one big wad with the Corinthians, and he has a perfect example, which we've seen used in many other places throughout the Scripture. I think certainly the book of Hebrews gives us numerous examples using Israel with regard to coming out from Egypt, etc., and their sin. And so here, one, he talks about, as he says in verse 6, lusting after evil things. Lusting after evil things, of course, is idolatry. Neither be idolaters. Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed. And then he comes down to a very interesting way of phrasing it, as he says here in verse 9, neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted. And this, of course, is something that perhaps the way of emphasizing it, I was looking the word up and it gives the basic idea of trying God's patience. How far can I go? And we think about our own patience. You think about a parent and a child will always try your patience. And at some point, you just have to say, that's it. And I think when we look at this situation, how long do you want to, don't tempt the Lord, don't try his patience, because one can certainly incur his wrath. But they certainly did that, and the children of Israel did that on numerous occasions, feeling that God and Moses demanded too much of them. When they longed for the things of the flesh that they had known in Egypt. And of course, you can think back to the things, when they were trying to remember the things that they had eaten and so forth. But I think this is one of the things, again, today in teaching. One of the lessons that we continue to want to put out in our lessons and sermons, don't tempt the Lord. And this is the kind of thing that maybe people don't recognize if we engage in sin. That's tempting the Lord. Michael, you look like you had something you were going to.
Well, it just I saw this in a definition of this, that it has the meaning of seeing how far one can go and get away with it without getting punished.
Well, that's a spiritual roulette.
And that's what you're talking about.
I don't know if I may have mentioned. Years ago, when I was in New York. We were walking down the street, and I saw these different vendors, and this vendor had this really big button. It was a red button with white writing on it. How much sin can I get away with and still go to heaven? Now, of course, that question belies a certain biblical ignorance already. But it is an idea that people may have of just how far can I push it and still be safe.
Is the attitude that what do I have to do so that I can go to heaven?
The minimum.
Yeah, the minimum. What's the minimum I have to do and get to heaven? You basically have the same idea.
And unfortunately, we find that there are some people, and maybe that, and I think this is why Paul is addressing the Corinthians this way. Don't let your spiritual life hang by the bare minimum. Where you, of course, we think today, of course, we have 2 worship services, midweek Bible classes, etc., fellowships, things like that. And some people may think, we would really hope that many Christians don't think this way. The idea of, well, if I at least go to Sunday morning services, they'll keep me on the membership roll. If I at least go to Sunday morning, I don't come to class, or I come in just as class is ending. I don't come back for the second service. I don't go to Wednesday night. I might show up for a fellowship here and there. That'll keep me on the membership roll, and as long as I'm on the membership roll, then I'm good. I'm safe. I don't have to worry about anything.
You're looking at the wrong row, man.
Well, we know that the church membership itself, in the parable of the net, there will be those that are and those that aren't. But you're right. It's looking at the wrong. It's a complete missing of the major point that God has always made. But certainly when we think about the children of Israel, they were discontent with what God had provided them. On occasion, they talked about wanting to return to Egypt. You have a lot of people who think like that. They want to return to the dominion of sin, or return to the world of sin. They don't recognize how the people uh, perished out in the wilderness. And we talked about this a few weeks ago, how many people were actually dying every day. Um, that's a tremendous number of people, hundreds of people a day. And certainly when we think about this, it ought to be, again, a poignant reminder to us of what it is that God expects. Paul then goes, just to move along, Paul goes into a really, really interesting area. Neither murmur ye, as some of them murmured. Now, the people, the children of Israel, were always complaining and murmuring against Moses. Now, do you think that when they were murmuring against Moses, Brian, do you think they thought that they were also, that they were murmuring against God, or do you think they just thought, well, I just don't like Moses?
They were being typically short-sighted and self-interested and godless people. It seems to be that actually the lessons that we obviously get from the New Testament is just how stupid and willful mankind can be in general, and to do that sort of thing is really absolute foolishness. And you'd think that people who are believing in God, what God has done for them already, seeing what God has done for them already, would have sort of shown a great deal more, been a lot more circumspect and thoughtful in what their disposition. But no, they behave like just typical sinners, unfortunately. I don't know what to say about it, except that, unfortunately, we're no different from they were.
Well, you know, that was then. People, they grumbled and were griping, and, they just were upset with the direction that the leaders were taking. They, at that time also the food that God gave them, all of these things. See, today people are much more civilized and sophisticated, and they don't complain about the leaders in the church, and they don't complain about the preachers anymore. It just doesn't happen. That's one of the lessons that we've learned about Israel. You don't hear people grumbling and murmuring and complaining anymore. They simply understand that the person who's preaching and teaching the Word of God it's not that person that they should be upset with. We've reached that state of higher spirituality, haven't we, Sonny? I mean, if you're talking to brethren and you are pointing out what the scriptures say on a particular issue, and they don't like it, they don't go and murmur and complain and talk behind your back anymore, do they?
Maybe they do.
Well, what else can I say, Johnny? I mean, that at the end of the day, is that shoot the messenger is the way to do it, man.
But do you think people? Brian used a really great word. He says short-sighted, and I think this is again where Peter says unable to see afar off, and I think sometimes people hear the message from you, hear the message from Michael, hear the message from preachers and teachers around the world, and they become, as you said, upset with the messenger. They hate you. When really do they really see that they are rebelling against God? We are earthen vessels, and if we simply deliver the message that is in the Word of God, and someone doesn't like it, doesn't want to comply, doesn't want to obey, it is not us that they're disobeying. It's not you. It's God that they are rebelling against. And yet we often see people get so upset I mentioned once some time ago when we had to read a withdrawal of fellowship letter in the congregation, and this to inform the congregation of our need to withdraw from this person who was fully accepting of the withdrawal. They accepted the charges, they admitted to them. They said, I know you're going to have to withdraw from me. So go ahead and send me the withdrawal letter. Now, you don't get many situations like that where a person says, I know that what I'm doing is wrong. I know what you have to do. I accept it. Go ahead and send it. Now, do you hear many of those, Michael?
No, not at all.
No. Now, this is what this person did. And yet, some people were upset with me because I read the letter. I mean, I can't even imagine what could be on that person's mind. When you have a person who fully admitted to sin, accepted that we have to withdraw from them, and fully admits that this is the right thing to do. Now again, this is not the usual situation, but it goes to show the extent to which people are unaccepting of God's discipline that we find in Hebrews chapter 12.
But especially when other people complain that it's done then.
And they complain that it's done. You hear all sorts, and I'm sure that everyone has some stories of this kind of thing, murmuring and complaining. I don't like that message. What they're really saying is he's stepping on my toes. He's dipping into my business. It's none of his concern. And no, it may not be the preacher's concern in an indirect way, but it's God's concern. And it's his concern that we do what's right and obey.
Maybe a good article for you to write, Johnny, would be what is said versus what is meant.
I mean, it is one of those things, and I think that this is an area though that the Bible addresses in more than one place of this as a sin. And murmuring, complaining, backbiting, gossiping, all of these things, only with the intent to tear down and disrupt the work of the church. It's always used for that reason, and the manner in which it's done is always underhanded, and it's one of the things here that when we see Paul addressing it, the Bible addresses it many, many times. Philippians 2:4, do all things without murmuring and disputing. Jude writes about it. These are murmurers, complainers, walking after their own lust. Exodus 15, the people murmured against Moses. We have so many examples here of where God is displeased with this type of thing. And yet we still see people engage in it. They're unsatisfied or dissatisfied, but it's to be expected. I don't want to say it's human nature, but I think it's an activity that people engage in when they are not focused or allowing the Word of God to have the proper effect in their life. When people they complain. I'm not talking about complaining when you go to a restaurant and your meat's overcooked. I'm talking about complaining when someone's trying to build one up spiritually, when one's trying to educate one spiritually. And again, we think about in the book of Hebrews, where, of course, there, in no uncertain terms, we are told, let's go to Hebrews chapter 12, where there it says, despise not the chastening of the Lord. Now, why don't people accept that?
simply because it seems to be that too many, we know that there are four different types of seed that the word could be planted in, or four types of ground rather, and unfortunately, the Bible does say many will try, but few will be able. And so the liberal forces that there are in the church, where allegedly people count them, they judge themselves by themselves, I think, is the right way to think about it. They don't judge themselves by God's standard, what God demands and expects of every Christian. They have their own standard, and it seems to be that they adhere to these throughout the years of their lives. They stop growing, they stop progressing, and unfortunately, well, these are the branches that are eventually going to be tossed in the fire, lake of fire.
There's also something inherent in the spiritual composition of a person who constantly murmurs and complains. It's just something in their spiritual makeup where they are constantly look as though they've been sucking lemons all day. They're just unhappy people, and I think it's sad, really. And Paul gets to that point with the Corinthians. I mean, he's basically saying that some of you are in this situation. Neither murmur ye as some of them. Now, Paul has always been very, and of course under the influence of God, very good and to couch this in a very clever way, where he says, "Don't do this as they did it." But there's a reason that he's saying that. There's a point behind it, and that is his awareness of the situation in Corinth already. And he's reminding them of how similar it is to the circumstances that we've been talking about with the children of Israel. Don't be a complainer, or don't continue to complain or murmur. He gets to this also a little bit later in the basic.
Do you think people
Go ahead, Michael.
in general do not think complaining is that bad?
Say that again.
Do you think that people in general don't think that complaining is that bad?
Well, I think most of the time everyone complains about something.
So it's not really, it's not that bad then.
Well, I think when it depends on where the complaint is being launched. If you complain about the cost of gasoline, or if you complain about the way your food is prepared, those are extraneous things that have no real bearing on the most important thing in life, and that's your spiritual destiny and path. When you complain against God, because those are things that are immaterial in so many ways. When you're complaining against God, that's a sin, and that's bad.
That's what I'm saying, though. Do people, because we do complain about, the price of grass or this or that, something was cooked too long or not long enough or whatever, that people's attitude about it is
about complaining itself.
It's no big deal. We do it all the time.
Well, that's why we have to, and why we continue to go through the scriptures.
And maybe, it might be as an insidious of a sin as any sin in a congregation could be.
Well, I think it could be almost more vile than most could be. I mean, if you have a sin of adultery or something, I mean, that's you can't say
it's obvious that it's sin.
That's an obvious one. But the sin of murmuring and complaining, and that's one that of course goes along with sowing discord. And I think that when you look at that, that is a work of Satan that has to be stomped out immediately. You have to erect. It's just like pulling weeds. You have to kill that.
You can destroy a congregation a lot easier by murmuring and complaining than you can by introducing false doctrine.
Yes, you can.
And that's what I'm getting at. We tend to think that murmuring is not really all that bad. Because, as you say, we do it all the time about these other things. And yet it's probably as bad of a sin or evil of a sin that you could find in a congregation.
Well, yes. That's. I mean, it causes, as you said, causes more splits probably than anything else. The discontent, and we see the effect that it had on the children of Israel. Just thinking about when Joshua and Caleb came back, the people were all over them, and that of course leads to the whole problem in the wilderness to begin with. But I think yes, it shows again a very, I don't want to say immature spiritual character. It shows a void of spiritual character because what one either is unaware of or really doesn't care about is the effect that it can have on a church on a whole. And when you don't have any concern for the Lord's church and the effect that this kind of thing can have, that means that souls don't really matter to you. That means that you don't have a value for the souls of others. There are so many ways to address, let's say, issues because people complain about things they don't like. But certainly that's the kind of thing that preachers probably, I guess preachers probably are the subject or object of murmuring and complaining more than anybody else. Follow closely by elders.
Well, yeah.
But mostly preachers. I don't like what he said. I don't like what you're preaching on. I don't like that letter that you sent out to the brethren, warning of this. I went to the mailbox, the PO box today, and saw we had a notice, a flyer about something that one of the congregations in the area on the East Bay, some sort of ladies' activity. So I looked at it, and one of the speakers for this ladies' activity is a member of a congregation at the Ripon Church of Christ in Ripon, California. Now, Ripon, California, the church there, among a number of other things they've been involved in, they heavily endorsed and advertised the Tahoe family encampment over the last few years, where John Clayton was speaking. Now, the people who are at that congregation that sent out the flyer, they probably don't even think about that. They probably don't even think that this woman belongs to a congregation that has actively promoted and then obviously condoned an activity, we'll just say encampment, where a speaker is a proponent of theistic evolution. And we're going to have her here to speak, not Santel, but this other congregation is going to have her to speak. And that should be okay. Now it really would be a waste of time for us to send out letters to every congregation in the area, because they're all going to go to something like that anyway. We don't have any fellowship with most of them anyway. But it's the kind of thing, again, where you see, going back to what you had mentioned earlier, it's no big deal. It really doesn't matter. So if you go and preach on it, which I'm going to do a little bit on Sunday, and mention it, some people, if they're visiting, might be upset and complain and murmur because we point this out. But that's just me.
Isn't it really a case, though, Johnny, of what sin do you accuse me? I mean, you can murmur about this, but are you saying I'm guilty of any particular sin, saying this or doing that and so on? It seems to be that they fall short of saying that you've sinned, but they just murmur.
Well, if the thing about that, Brian, is if you can get to it at that early point, they probably won't even have an answer for you. Usually the murmuring and complaining goes on behind your back, and you don't even know about it until they put the knife halfway in.
Yeah.
You know. But
Right. Yes.
but we'll go ahead. I was going to say we'll come to a conclusion of our discussion today. Next week we want to look at verses 11 through 13. Very important verses, and I think verses that should be of tremendous encouragement to us. Paul comes to this point in his epistle where he is trying to, after having laid out a number of concerns and issues with the brethren in Corinth, giving them a way that they can, of course, utilize a strategy that will take care of any issues that they may have to confront in the future. So we want to thank you for being with us this morning or afternoon or evening, depending on your location. We hope that you will join us next week. We certainly hope that you have enjoyed our discussion this afternoon. Thank you very much, and we say bye-bye.